Arslan, the Warriors of Legend, is the newest hack-and-slash title from Koei, makers of the Dynasty Warriors series. We're just 2 years into the next generation, and we've already seen this engine used for a total of 4 games. Does Arslan offer anything new, or is this just a reskinning of a dozen other Koei games? You play the majority of the game as the Prince of Pars, Arslan, who goes on an adventure to avenge his father, the king, who is betrayed by one of his closest supporters. You'll meet many characters along your journey, and just about all of them are playable, 15 in total, and each have unique weapons and abilities. The story actually reminds me of something Zhang Yimou may have directed in the early 2000s. Also, the game's dialogue is in Japanese, so expect to do a lot of reading. There are 15 missions and moderately lengthy cutscenes between every single one of them. Being a purist, I prefer Japanese language tracks, but it does cause a problem when, during a mission, there's a lot of banter between characters. It's difficult to read and fight hundreds of enemies at the same time. It's difficult to get too deep into this review without mentioning the graphics. While this isn't much of a leap from last generation, the cel-shaded visuals are fantastic, and I would argue this is the most beautiful Koei game ever produced. The game is broken into 50 missions across 12 large maps. A scenario typically consists of you fighting a large group of enemies to advance to the next area, which almost always requires you to defeat a named officer or bosses. Most missions take around 3 to 5 minutes to complete, though a handful require a considerably longer amount of time. This game is very well paced, and that a mission never feels so lengthy that you start to lose interest with the simplistic combat. And just because I say the combat is simple, doesn't mean that it's not a lot of fun, because it is. Even though you're mostly just button mashing, you feel like a badass, and filling up your special meter for devastating attacks is exceptionally fulfilling. You can fight on foot or on horseback. The main purpose of mounted combat is so that you can move quicker, but you don't get your special abilities. Comparing Arslan to previous iterations of Koei's infamous combat engine, there's definitely a slew of improvements here, and that's great news since, for what seemed like a decade, the engine didn't seem to improve one bit. Combat is much more fluid and feels a lot more natural, unlike the stiff combat of previous Warriors titles. Killing enough enemies can unlock a large beam of blue light called a rush. These bring in an insane number of friendly units you can control all together to eliminate massive hordes of enemies instantly. While this is a cool feature, it's always tied to a mission objective, so you can't get these just for fun. They're always required. Though some of your unlocked characters will join you in combat, they're moderately useless, even against enemies you can cut down 50 at a time in a single slash. Some missions have you tasked with keeping them all alive, and that can be a chore considering how passive they are in combat. At any time, you can join in a second player locally, which is something I'm very glad that Koei's kept intact. There's online co-op as well, and it works very well and makes the game even more fun than it already is. And that's really the point here. This game is fun. It's not nearly as deep as some of Koei's other games. In fact, the game is completely linear and you don't even have equipment. You do get cards which you can equip for stat boosts, and you can equip mods for weapons to give them elemental abilities. But Arslan is missing many of the RPG elements from previous titles. Despite this game having a streamlined feel to it, I think this is actually a plus rather than a minus. I've always felt Dynasty Warriors games have been a little bit too complex for their own good. This game reminds me a lot of 99 Nights on the Xbox 360, and that was a game that was severely underrated. Not the sequel though, it was horrible. There's really not a whole lot to complain about with Arslan Warriors of Legend. Sure, the Koei engine has some technical issues, such as enemies popping in right in front of you, but these games don't sell very well, particularly in the United States. They can't spend 2 years and $100 million to develop sequels, and that's why they've already released 4 games this generation. For that reason, I'm not going to hold Koei to the standards of developers like Rockstar Games or Naughty Dog. Arslan is the most accessible game I've ever played from this venerable Japanese developer, and honestly, we go back to the days of Nobunaga's Ambition on the NES and Romance of the Three Kingdoms on the Super Nintendo. Arslan the Warriors of Legend is an excellent way for new gamers to get into a Koei game. It's not for everyone, but any fan of action games should give this one a shot. It's a lot of fun, especially with a friend, and for that reason I'm scoring it an 8 out of 10. There's still room for the engine to grow, but I'm glad to see that the combat has come a long way since the stiffness from previous Dynasty Warrior outings.